Gaming has evolved over the years quite a bit. We're often talking about graphics or gameplay conventions, but let's talk about problems. A lot of problems have been solved, but adjacent problems have appeared. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, we want to talk about 7 gamer problems then versus now. At number 7, the first thing we want to talk about is waiting in line for a midnight release versus waiting for the download. If you gamed in a previous era, you most likely at least know somebody who stayed in line for a midnight release of a console or a game. It's not just that they wanted to play the game, this was also kind of a community event in some weird ways. You knew who was a gamer in the area. You maybe met new people, you maybe had great conversations about the games you like. And while this isn't completely gone, there are still things where people do this. Oftentimes new console releases specifically. Nowadays, we wait for the download. Yes, you can preload. A lot of the times you get the option to, and I certainly do when it's possible. You're also, let's say you're playing the game on console and you've neglected an update. Well, you're waiting for that too. And then let's make the assumption that they release a day 1 patch. Do you wait for that to play the game? Because it is the day 1 patch that kind of really is the actual release day version of the game. In some cases, you're allowed to preload those, and that's very nice. In fact, if you're a developer out there and have the option to do that, please do. We've seen a large mix of different situations, and of course, if we can all play the game at the same time, that's generally the best. And in some ways, the kinds of community that we've lost from no longer having the big day 1 release midnight lines, we see games kind of supplementing that community, giving us an online community, which is probably neither all good or all bad. It's certainly different though. At number 6, the problem of having fewer games that you've probably finished every single one of and play over and over again versus having a huge backlog on Steam and PlayStation Plus and Xbox Game Pass and buying tons of games at 80% off. Never finishing any of them. I still boot up a number of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games on the regular. I know them by heart, I can play them like they're nothing, and they don't offer me anything particularly new at this stage in my life, because I've seen every corner of them. But I still do it, because I still have this habit. There's something maybe comforting about it. But way back in the day, playing the same games was kinda dull. The ones that you wanted to play, you would play, and you would beat. And there wouldn't be more for a while because the game industry was not nearly as large as it is today. But now we kind of have the opposite problem. I mentioned all of the services that we get games from basically every single month, building this massive backlog of free games and discounted games, Steam sales giving us 85% off, and it just always grows. There's never not a new game to play, which is cool. I mean, it's a thing that makes me think that we have way more choice, but it's kind of boredom versus being overwhelmed. I've seen every corner of that game versus I have no idea what game to play. There's so many. If I played every single game I wanted to play, I wouldn't do other things, like sleep and eat. At number 5, working very hard to unlock Unlockables versus nowadays justifying paying for them. You see, back in the day, Unlockables were something you earned. You played the game a lot and you were rewarded for it. This was, of course, when they made games that you bought. You would buy the game and then you would get the game, all of the game. It'd be on a disc or a cartridge and you would work for a very long time to find all of the secrets that were difficult and insane even to unlock. And while this isn't a time-efficient thing to do by any means, and often it really isn't that big of an accomplishment, when you work super hard to get the pink camo vest or some crap that you don't really need for the sake of 100%ing the game or something. And now the Unlockables, you buy them. They're a thing you can buy. And you know, they tend to be things that are slightly more interesting than, like, the random vest. Although not all the time. Sometimes they're the random vest. Either way, they cost money now. And while that is a lot more time efficient, in the game. Money comes from somewhere, so is it actually more time efficient? If you earned that money, you worked for it, meaning in some weird way your time outside the game was spent on leveling up or getting an item in the game. In some respects, I really wish that we would go back to cheat codes for these sort of less important little things that are in the game, goofy stuff, because really neither of these things are great, given like what you're unlocking for the majority of the time. That's not to say there aren't cool unlockables, there definitely are. But even when we weren't paying for it, I wasn't really spending the time to get them either, unless they were really cool. And now we're paying for them, and I can't even begin to talk about how much I dislike that. At number 4, reaching save points versus too many autosaves. So the problem of save points is, of course, that there's never enough of them, even if there's too many of them. In some games, it seems like they're quite plentiful until you actually need them. From time to time, you have the perfectly paced game that has a save point exactly when it should be, but that was an art that was mastered by developers who had a keen eye for pace. Now, when we switched over to autosave basically being the norm in every game, it's hard for me to say that's something I'm upset about. It's definitely useful. I pretty much never lose progress now. That's not bad. But if I do want to backtrack in my game, it's so much harder to. To some extent, it requires a change in plans when you backtrack through saves. And having it so, let's say there was a save point after a story beat and before a boss, it was actually much easier to sort of think about what you were trying to do. It was sometimes harder to maintain your game. You would lose progress if you could get 3/4 of the way through an area of the game and then died every time. You would continually lose all of that progress, which sucks. But when you have so many autosaves, when it's around every corner the game is saving, you really just don't know where to go back to if you're wanting to make some changes in your run. At number 3, let's talk hype. Way back in the day, we waited every month to get the smallest amount of information on any game we wanted to play, whether it was our favorite game, whether it was just a new game we were interested in. We waited for gaming magazines to tell us what the hell was going on. And when they did, it was basically nothing. It was always these tiny little blurbs that weren't really enough. Until they did a full preview on the game, which was basically torture. Previews during this era were basically reviews of an imaginary game, coming up with the possibilities and opining about how wonderful it could be. It was much easier to get very hyped over games in that era. But nowadays, we have so much information on every game all the time. There are exceptions, of course, but it's so hard not to know everything about a game before it comes out now. I am so rarely surprised by anything in this era of gaming that even just a surprise, not even a good one, feels like it's automatically good. By the time you get a game, you know so much about it. In some cases, you're just going through the motions. Not in all of them, of course. And sometimes the motions are very fun, and it's okay to do that. But I find myself not really getting super hyped for a lot of games now. I think it's because of how much information they put out. Some games I get hyped for still, but they tend to withhold information. Like, look at Cyberpunk. They've given us a ton of information, but not enough to feel like it's too much. At number 2 is waiting for your buddy to pass the controller because it's your turn, i.e. waiting your turn, versus, I don't know, kind of that still, but there's so much more online lobby waiting now. Like, in single-player games, oftentimes you'll trade off, and there's single-player games. We had quite a drought, but we've been seeing more of them, and a lot of people play games that way, the trade-off. I personally do that with a lot of friends because a lot of us tend to like single-player games more than multiplayer ones. But with the introduction of the online lobby and matchmaking, oftentimes it's waiting to get through the match, I guess, which can be excruciating if they have a different playstyle than you or they're not as good as you and you're just like, give me that. You're doing it wrong. I don't know. It's not always like that, of course, but it's kind of a problem that hasn't really been solved and maybe can't be. It's just a little different nowadays. And finally, at number 1, a problem that is actually kind of similar in that respect. It's not something that I think anyone's ever going to actually completely fix, and it's still around, though in a different form. And it's leaving your console on with the TV shut off because the game doesn't have a save feature or something. So when you wake up on Saturday morning to play the game, your dad's like, "Oh, you left the game on. I shut it off for you. You're welcome." I mean, we still have a similar problem in that a lot of games end up erasing people's save files, and that's pretty much the same net effect. It just sucks. Like, there's not a lot else to say. It's awful when that happens. The problems of yesteryear and today's problems. Just fun to talk about our problems, isn't it? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like, and if you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe, and don't forget to enable all notifications. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on GameRanx.